So thank you all for coming, and thank you to the conference organizers. My name is Martin Lundfall, and I'm from Circles. If you were expecting a talk from Circle, then you're subject to an unfortunate typo, and actually Circles is not has not just acquired Poloniex, but we are a universal basic income project based cryptocurrency. And so I'm gonna do a little bit of an experiment in this presentation and differ from how we usually present Circles. Because usually the way we talk about Circles is that we start talking about universal basic income and firmly establish how awesome universal basic income is. And then we think, well, if this is so good, then why should we wait for governments to implement universal basic income? Why can't we just make it ourselves? And then we come to the Circles conclusion, which is universal basic income basically now, instead of waiting for the government to implement it. But for this presentation, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about currency systems, monetary systems in general, and tokens also in general, and value in general. So a little bit of a more philosophical take on what tokens are, what value is, and what in particular we would like our tokens to represent. And through that, I hope to reach the conclusion that if you want to make a currency system that is truly fair and decentralized, it becomes kind of hard to imagine a different scheme than Circles. So, let me begin by saying that tokens are representations of value. And so the design of a token determines which particular value that token will encode. Not merely in terms of the code or the implementation of the token, but also in terms of the cultural memes that we attach to the token. And when I talk about tokens here, I talk fairly generally about tokens, so not just ERC20s or tokens on any cryptocurrency platform, but also tokens like fiat currency also being a token, or a diploma from a university being a token that represents the value of education. Or, you know, an artist retrospective also being a token that shows that an artist is really valued by the community. But the fundamental proposition that we believe is that the current monetary system does a very poor job of encoding the values that we share as a society. So the fiat monetary system is not a very well-designed system for encoding the types of values that we share. And there are some particular things that we can say about the fiat monetary system on why this is. Mainly, it favors the few. It is a system in which a subset of actors, a very tiny subset of actors, have privileges of printing and allocating new money. And furthermore, and this is through fractional reserve banking, of course. And furthermore, through fractional reserve banking and through this whole process, when you are minting new tokens and giving them to people as loans, not only is all money created as debt, which if you've read David Graeber might have always been the case, but it's also debt that is attached to interest, so that you constantly need to pay back more money than exists, and the only way to fuel the system is through infinite growth. And now economic growth is not inherently coupled to the destruction of the planet, but it is tightly correlated. And if it is decoupling, then that decoupling is not happening quick enough. So it's very, very hard to imagine that in our current monetary system, we're gonna move away from the type of environmental destruction that we're seeing right now, because it's inherently something that arises from the design of our monetary system under fractional reserve banking. And there are some nice sources, if you doubt that claim, that outline that proposition in more detail. So, if the monetary system does not capture what we value, then maybe we should say first what we do value as a society. And of course, this is extremely hard and something that should be discussed at length over various glasses of various substances. But I don't have time to go into that sort of discussion right now, so I'm going to say some fairly uncontroversial things that many of us can agree on, that we all value. And those things are people and equality. That's fairly uncontroversial to say, that those are two things that almost everybody values. So if these are the things that we want to capture in a monetary system, then how does that influence a design choice when it comes to designing a monetary system? Well, I'm arguing that what we should strive for is fair predistribution to all. And what I mean by predistribution here, this is a term that is used in economical circles in a slightly different meaning, but what I mean by it here in terms of tokens, I mean by predistribution the allocation of the initial supply of the token and the allocation of newly minted tokens, if that is something that the token has built in. So to say that we are striving for fair predistribution means that the initial supply and newly minted tokens, where those tokens go, should not be determined by a proper subset of the actors in the system, unless those actors have been given explicit privileges by the rest of the community. So nobody should be able to change the rules or the specifications of how new tokens are allocated. And that's the first condition. And the second condition is that the early mover advantage should not be extreme. And now, I think it should be clear that the first condition is not met by fiat currencies, because we have banks under fractional reserve banking that are given privileges that the rest of us don't have in terms of minting money. And that the second one is what disqualifies most cryptocurrencies, that there is really an unfair advantage if you got into cryptocurrencies early, and that really doesn't make it a fair system. If we look at how wealth is distributed within cryptocurrencies, this is, of course, pretty hard to measure for different reasons. Bitcoin, for example, is pseudonymous, and several people can own a single address, and a single person can own several addresses, so it's hard to establish a notion of who owns what. But we do know that there are whales, and that the whales are pretty significant in terms of the wealth that they own. And it's really hard to really make the claim that you have the same opportunity to get in and share a piece of the pie if you got into Bitcoin now as a couple of years ago. And so this is an interesting graph, which I think is taken from September last year, which again has a bunch of problems associated with it. Like, we know that many of these addresses might belong to exchanges, and so those addresses might not reflect really one single owner, but several people owning that share of the pie collaboratively. But still, whenever we try to estimate the wealth distribution within cryptocurrencies, it does look a lot worse in terms of equality than most countries. Like, if you measure the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of how much of the accumulated percentage of the population owns which percentage of the accumulated wealth, then it is kind of hard to believe that there's any substance in the claim that cryptocurrencies are more decentralized or more equal in this sense than most countries are. So, yeah, just to highlight, there's 4.11% of all Bitcoin addresses that owns 96.53% of all of the Bitcoin. So in this aspect, the claim of decentralization is hard to make. There are, of course, other factors that go into it, but this is what we mean by an extreme early mover advantage. So, enough critique of cryptocurrencies and enough critique of the fiat monetary system. I don't think that for this audience I need to critique the fiat monetary system very much, because most of us are here because we think so. And so instead we should answer the question of, well, how should we design a better system? How can we design a monetary system that do have these properties? Yeah, well, you know the properties, I said them already. So, and this is where we propose Circles as a fair cryptocurrency. And the architecture of Circles can be pretty much split up into two parts. The primordial soup of personalized currencies, which is really the core of the idea of Circles, and then just some cherry on top. I'm gonna speak a little bit quickly about community currencies. That's the wrong direction. So, what is Circles? Circles is a system in which users are continuously given newly minted tokens. And the thing about this is that the tokens that they are given is particular to each user. So everybody gets a personalized currency, and they are continuously given new units of that personal currency. And then to make trade with others and to really build a network out of this instead of just having your coin for yourself, every person operates within a web of trust. So you individually choose which other people you know are actual people and not Sybil accounts. And then you say, hey, I'm willing to accept your currency one-to-one with my own because we're people and we're gonna want to do trade with each other. We're gonna operate as humans in the system. And this is how the Sybil attack vector is mitigated, by making sure that everybody chooses individually which other people they're willing to do trade with. And if somebody accepts a Sybil account into their web of trust, then the attack is localized to that particular account, because it's really only you that suffer and not the entire system. So the Sybil account vector is localized. And so this really makes Circles a trust-backed currency, because the web of trust is at focus and the universal basic income is built into the monetary system. So this is the base layer and the like core idea of Circles. So now we have a currency that has universal basic income as issuance scheme, and that is decentralized. So that's great, but it's kind of a difficult system to use. Oh, but before I go on, I should talk about transitive transfers. So if we imagine us operating within this web of trust, then at some point I'm gonna encounter a person that I don't know probably, and that I don't have in my direct network of trust. But there might be that this person is only one hop away or a couple of hops away from me in the web of trust. And I can still do trade with that person using the mechanism of a transitive transfer. And this works as follows. Let's imagine that we are Carol in this scenario, and we want to pay Bob some money because he is offering us a delicious sandwich. So Bob doesn't trust us directly, so he's not going to accept our currency, but Bob does trust Alice, and Alice trusts us. So we can still transfer money to Bob by going via Alice, And this is something that's going to happen automatically in the system. This is not something that Alice is going to be aware of even happening. But what we're going to do is that we send Alice 5 of our Carol coins, and Alice sends 5 of Alice coins to Bob. And therefore, Bob has always received currency directly from a person that he trusts, and we've been able to pay for the good that we wanted, this delicious sandwich. And this can also happen in several steps. We can do this transitively, basically for as many hops as we need. Okay, but still, this system does require a lot of input from the users, and if we imagine people that are less into thinking about what money is and different monetary systems and are mainly interested in buying sandwiches and not so much managing their trust network and dealing with all of this complicated stuff, then it's easily imagined a system on top of this primordial soup of personal currencies that we can think of as community currencies, which is people coming together to form a community that has a unified token. So one token that is the same among every person in the community. And this is not only nice because people in the community can now exchange goods way easier, but you can also imagine that the the community implements a changing exchange rate over time for the personalized currencies of the people in the community, so as to try to establish stability of the community currency. And here it becomes obvious that if we do imagine community currencies to exist on top of circles, then we can't really separate governance from the monetary system, because these communities are going to have to make decisions. They're going to make decisions like who is a part of this community, what is the monetary policy of the community. They can't change the fact that everybody is going to get their community currency as a basic income. Otherwise it wouldn't be circles. But they can change the exchange rate, so to try to establish the stability. And they need to make a decision on that. And they need to make a decision on how they value other communities' currencies. And this makes it obvious that they're going to have to make decisions somehow, and this is where it becomes really interesting to explore different governance models for these communities. And we really want to maintain the sort of individual freedom and still have the community decision-making respect that. So we're going to explore some different models when it comes to how these communities make decisions. But there's also an interesting point that can be made here, which is that since these community currencies will make choices on how to accept other community currencies, then instead of this being simply the second step, we can sort of see this as an induction step that makes the whole system sort of composable, and that the community currencies now operate on a similar ground as the individual currencies. Okay, so now I'll go through the usual claim for why Circles is nice, which is basically the claim that universal basic income is nice. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I'll say the most important things, in my opinion, on why universal basic income is really nice. First of all, there are many studies that have been made on the topic that have shown that it reduces poverty, obviously, it reduces crime because people are not stealing food to survive and stuff like that. It does reduce inequality, it improves health. So in general, there are many societal aspects of actually real value being created, and also monetary value, if that's really something that you want to put into the equation, which you might. But more importantly, I think, are the sort of political or cultural changes that a universal basic income can bring about, which is that we start thinking about labor and work differently. There's a decoupling of labor and compensation, which can really change the current political environments where everything is being done for the ultimate purpose of creating more work, to an environment where we start to really experiment more freely with what it means to be human and do human things rather than just working. And there's also a psychological change in humans that happen when they have their basic income being met, which is that they start going from the cutthroat survival mode that you're in if you are really poor and you constantly need to prove to some institution that you are really doing what you can to get a job or whatever. And it changes you psychologically to go into a more of a human mode where you can really think about, well, what would I like to do and how would I like to help my community? How would I like to partake in society? So those are the ups, and some of the downs that people usually bring up when it comes to universal basic income are really misconceptions. And so if you doubt these, I have sources for you. So the common misconceptions is that people are gonna, if they get a basic income, basically become couch potatoes that drink a lot of alcohol and do a lot of drugs. But this has been shown in quite a few studies that it doesn't really tend to happen. Number 5 here is a nice meta-study that contains a lot of different experiments around the world, where it's actually been shown that generally people tend to consume less temptation goods. And the amount that people stop working when they have basic income is very minor. And usually if people stop working, they tend to do pretty nice productive things like get educated, take care of the elderly, and work on community projects like that, which is not recognized as labor by our current society, but is still something that we think is important for people to do. But of course, Circles is not a universal basic income as much as it is a distributed basic income. Because universal basic income is too important to wait for the government to implement. And we can already do it because we have this fantastic blockchain technology that allows us to build our own monetary systems. And this is what we should explore. And this is what we should be building with these systems. And so I'm gonna end by basically, I'm not gonna end quite there. I'm gonna talk about our sort of roadmap for the project. If you've heard about Circles before, then you might have heard it from Martin Köppelmann, who has been thinking about this for a long time and has been writing about it for a long time. But it was only fairly recently that we started working on this as a team and actively developing it. And now our plan is to roll out a pilot project in Berlin this year. We have a cafe set up there where people are actually going to be able to spend their Circles. And we're talking to different vendors to make sure that we really bootstrap the economy that Circles needs in order to become useful as a currency. And then we have prospects of where we can take this experiment after Berlin. And if this is something that interests you and you feel like you have a good site in mind, then please come talk to us. Because we really want to experiment with different types of communities and different types of economies and see how Circles functions in that particular locale. So here's where I'm gonna end instead. I'm gonna end on a little bit of a call to arms, because it's become kind of disenfranchising, I think, the way in which this community is developing, which is that we all came in, or at least most of us came into this space under the narrative that blockchains would really bring a decentralized future that would be a decoupling from the monetary system and would bring us all of these nice things like a new way to establish commons, a new way of collaborating between people to solve coordination problems. But so far, it's kind of hard to see that as having been done. And really what is most particular about the space right now is that it has made a bunch of white males fairly rich. So we know that story, like that has happened before. So that's not a very interesting story, and that's not the story that I would like the blockchain to tell. And I think we really need to work hard on establishing the purpose of blockchains as really maintaining the commons, building monetary systems that make sense, and collaborating and coordinating people. And it's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen if we just put a blockchain on some random business process. I mean, it might be a tiny improvement, but it's not the type of significant change that I think that blockchain is really capable of bringing. So yes, thank you all for my talk. These references for the claims that I was making, if you doubt them, then you can find the slides and the references on Twitter. Thank you very much.